Have been provided all the correspondence on table. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a written note here from Councillor Bryce about some possible changes to this, but I'm going to go to Councillor Haynes, who's asked to speak.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, if I may, I have some questions from staff, so I'm more fully understanding some aspects of our protective system. So, if I may,
Councillor Haynes.
Outside of the EDPA bylaw and outside of tree protection and streamside protection, there's the environmental and social review process. This has been in existence since 1992, and I have some questions just to clarify, if I may, to our CAO. That this environmental review process is administered by the planning department. All zoning and subdivision applications shall be screened to determine whether or not an ESR is needed, environmental and social review. That the application should be recommended for an environmental and social review where within 60 metres of a marine shoreline. Would that mean, Mr. CEO, that the entire shoreline of Saanich to the marine environment has a 60-metre buffer, that within that 60 metre, any development, subdivision or rezoning has the potential for staff to ask for an environmental and social review?
To be blunt, Councillor, I haven't looked at the ESR framework in preparation for the meeting, so I don't have a response for you.
Okay. I have a copy here that says that it is 60 metres of the shoreline, so I'm assuming that's the case, that I'm reading the current version, which was in September 2002.
Councillor Haynes, why don't I redirect your question to our Director of Planning?
Director of Planning, could you help me out on this, please?
Council has the discretion to activate the environmental and social review on applications for rezoning and subdivision involving rezoning. The question that you raised in regarding the 60 metres is accurate. That's in regard to rezoning and subdivision. That also includes rezoning. Straight subdivisions are the purview of the approving officer, and they would make the decision on any bylaws application or any conditions related to subdivisions that do not involve rezoning.
Very good. So just for point of clarification, because some members have presented, of the public have presented that there is no protection without the EDPA, but this is clearly saying that 60 metres of the shoreline to the marine environment has a protective mechanism that can be activated on those cases where there's a development application or rezoning. Separately, the same bylaw applied, same policy applies within 50 metres of a natural park, within 50 metres of an agricultural land reserve, within 50 metres of a watercourse, river, lake designated pursuant to Saanich bylaws, or within 50 metres of a floodplain development permit area. Outside of the urban containment boundary, this policy is activated if there's an application for commercial use, if there's an application for industrial use.
Councillor Haynes, we're getting some commentary.
But my point here would be...
I just wanted to give you a bit of guidance. You're reading to the audience, and you wanted to ask a question.
I am.
So if you could please direct the question to our Director of Planning or any other staff member you'd like to. Thank you.
So each of these things and institutionals, in each of these cases then, if there was an application, what is the process for the environmental and social review policy to be activated?
As outlined in the policy, we inform Council when applications that fall under this policy are made to the District of Saanich, and you as Council have the ability to trigger a discussion on those. Whether or not you actually require the ESR is Council discretion.
Okay, thank you very much. One last one, which is interesting. It says, when the land in question is deemed to be environmentally sensitive. My reading of that would be that it's not restricted then to a 50-metre or 60-metre designation, but would be determined by a judgment of if the land is environmentally sensitive. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
And our CAO. Today, Council received largely, well, I suspect because several of us asked for it, but we asked for that discernment between the protections of the EDPA versus the ESR. And Councillor Haynes has asked a question for clarification, but the note that we received included the comments that the following activities would not be reviewed for ecological impacts, and that list included building permits, plastic permits, fill permits, tree permits, excavation, regrading, vegetation, and clearing. Can you tell me why that wouldn't be covered based on what Councillor Haynes has just asked?
As an example, building permits are received daily for the construction of a single-family house, as an example. If a rezoning is not required, if a subdivision with a rezoning is not required, then that would not be that would not trigger the ESR review. So it would just be processed as a standard building application, and there would be no mechanism in the pre-2012 condition to activate any form of environmental review other than what's currently on the books.
Okay, but then let me ask the pointed million-dollar question, if you don't mind. In your mind, as our Director of Planning, is it your opinion that the ESR is an adequate protection if the EDPA is rescinded? Does it meet the needs of Saanich?
It's a very hard question.
I acknowledge it goes into the realm of politics, but I am interested if, in your comment, if the ESR provides us enough coverage.
I think that's always in the eye of the beholder. I think I made the statement fairly clearly at the Committee of the Whole that a rescinding of the bylaw and a return to the bylaw regulation that existed at 2012 puts Saanich back to the protections that were in place in 2012, which is less than the protections that are in place today. The ESR was a stopgap measure that focuses on rezonings and subdivisions that include rezonings. The information that staff provided you today in response to questions indicates that leaves out a number of other development-related applications that wouldn't trigger the ESR. The ESR is not a replacement for the EDPA.
But just for clarification, and I'm fine not having the question answered any further, the question then would remain, the ESR is only a tool for rezoning and subdivision. It is not for single families.
It's only a tool for rezonings and subdivisions that are including a rezoning or subdivisions arising out of rezonings.
Okay, thank you for answering the questions.
I was going to suggest that. So there's a recommendation here. There's been a request to separate. There's nothing to really divide at this point. So if someone just wants to put A forward, we could deal with that, and then we could deal with B subsequently. I'll go with Councillor Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will move one.
Moved and seconded, thank you. Councillor Harper, you still have the microphone if you want to motivate.
Okay. I am moving this motion in order for a new and better bylaw to be developed. And I understand there is a friendly amendment going to be forthcoming from Councillor Bryce to clarify further the motion. This has been a very long journey for everyone. And as I have said before, this is not about being pro or anti the environment. And I feel very sad that the discussion today was often couched in those terms. As I reflect on where we are today, I look back to years of public input, not months and not days. And virtually all of that, almost all of that input over those years has been in favor of
EDPA.
Doing something fairly significant to this bylaw. I think about Julian Dunster, who spoke at the May 13th, 2017 Town Hall. He was the person who developed the GIS mapping for the Ministry of the Environment, which is today being used by Saanich in terms of the EDPA. And he quite clearly advised Council at that meeting that this was not an appropriate use of the mapping tool which he had created for the province. I've also been reviewing materials from the past, starting with the staff report dated September 17th, 2015 on the Rainbow Street properties. In that report, it was noted that provincial standards for sensitive ecosystem mapping would result in 99.2% of the properties in the EDPA being removed from the EDPA. The point of all of this is to say that we are a place where we need to rebuild the bylaw, not pick it apart. And we need to build a bylaw which has a clear vision of what to protect and how to protect it. It needs to be based on scientific methods that are consistent with provincial and federal standards, that focus on sensitive ecosystems and species at risk on municipal lands, and lands subject to rezoning or subdivision. As a person who, one of the speakers noted, who once led the policy branch at the BC Pension Corporation and had staff working on a multitude of issues for the pension boards, I well understand when it is time to start over again rather than just amend a rule. And that's the stage that I have reached at this point. Many of the recommendations from the Diamond Head report will be helpful, but do not go far enough in establishing a clear vision for a future bylaw or in ensuring that there will be processes in place that we do not return to constant conflict in the future. There are those who seem to believe that residents will raise their property once this rescission takes place. I have far more faith in our residents. We have already temporarily exempted all the single-family residences, and I have not noted any large changes in behavior on those properties. I see the overwhelming majority of our residents as being stewards of their properties, and in the most positive of senses. I believe that in these matters, a carrot is much better than a stick, so I look forward to the subsequent motion from Councillor Plant. And indeed, we have heard from owners who indicated that the current state of affairs has kept them from making changes of any sort to their properties, even to the point of not dealing with invasive plants that have often moved into their properties from Saanich parks. And because we do have a temporary exemption of single-family properties, I would argue that the environmental and social review process provides quite a robust protection for rezonings and redevelopments, in fact, in Saanich. And so while we are waiting to get better processes in place, there is nothing there anymore. And I think Council is very aware of the need to follow up on that. So I would say that after nearly 3 years of input from the public, it is time to move forward. And the best way to do that is to start over.
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest an amendment. I'm going to suggest that, and this is hard because we haven't just had the motion read, but on that first motion, at the end of it, that the amendment would be, and that all bylaw amendments be undertaken concurrently.
Second.
And just speaking to that amendment, I think this would capture, in essence, what we all committed to and what the text around this motion alludes to. But this would capture it in the motion to signal that by doing any of the bylaw amendments concurrently, we will not be leaving the municipality without the protections that existed in 2012. We know that there are bylaws to do with fill, to do with the trees, streamside protection, any other OCP amendments that will have to be considered should be in place and dealt with at the same time that the motion to rescind takes place. So I think that this amendment shouldn't be contentious. It really just captures what we had committed to previously.
Thank you, Councillor.
Members of the public who have taken time to come out and speak to this item many times, just as Council has responded many times. And I heard the words tonight, to retain is responsible and it's to do the right thing. And I think for all of us, we have to get past the notion that to rescind is to be less environmentally responsible than to retain. I really believe everyone in this room wants to see an EDPA in Saanich, and I believe we will arrive at it, and it won't be quick, but we will arrive at it. I believe the EDPA, when it was thought of, we thought it would create a better Saanich, and we thought it would be a benefit to all our Saanich residents. And I think as we've seen it roll out and implemented, the EDPA has become a very decisive, or it's not decisive, I wish it was decisive, divisive bylaw, and it's become a them and an us. And I believe we erred in the implementation of it, and I've said it before, we can blame certain groups, we can blame council, we can blame staff, we can blame the community, but I think there's enough blame. If we want to blame someone, there's a little bit there for all of us. I believe the present EDPA requires more than just fine-tuning or minor changes or just a tweaking. I believe it needs a restart, rebuilding. And I believe we can do it with the input of many of our Saanich residents now that we understand what we're trying to do and where we're trying to go with it. And I believe as we come with the new EDPA, I believe there will be much more clarity in it, and our residents will understand what we are trying to do and what it is meant to do. And because of that, I do support rescinding it and rebuilding and starting again. Thank you.
Opposed? Councillor Murdoch, Councillor Brownoff, Councillor Sanders are opposed. Then amendment carries. So we now have an amended motion on the floor. Who would like to speak on the amended floor? Who would like to speak on the amended motion? Someone must have speak. I got something to say. Someone must have speak.
Thanks to the many folks who came to speak to us this evening on the occasion to ratify the decision from the Committee of the Whole on the October 28th meeting. I appreciated once again the benefit of your input. Did note that there were a number of new voices that expressed concern about the recommendation coming out of that.
Councillor Murdoch, Councillor Brownoff, Councillor Sanders are opposed. Then amendment carries. So we now have an amended motion on the floor. Who would like to speak on the amended motion? Someone must have speak. I got something to say, but I'm going to go to Council first. Councillor Murdoch.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks to the many folks who came to speak to us this evening on the occasion to ratify the decision from the Committee of the Whole on the October 28th meeting. I appreciated once again the benefit of your input. Did note that there were a number of new voices that expressed concern about the recommendation coming out of that Committee of the Whole meeting. And I have to say that the views expressed that they were caught off guard by a motion to rescind coming out of a discussion that was intended to be contemplation of the recommendations from the Diamond Head report. I have to tell you, I was also caught off guard by Council's decision to do that. In my view, I think Council had the opportunity to consider the recommendations that came out of a fairly extensive engagement process that informed the development of those recommendations, many of which I think would have been a considerable improvement on the EDPA. Clearly, while it may be politically expedient to get rid of the bylaw, I don't think it makes good public policy. And regrettably, I think that that is a decision that turns its back on a long history of good public policy when it comes to environmental protection and environmental stewardship in Saanich. For goodness sake, we call the official community plan Sustainable Saanich. And I have to tell you that the decision to roll back the clock to protections that existed in 2012 is not representative of sustainable Saanich. I I think it would be beneficial for us to take seriously those recommendations to improve on the bylaw. Without a doubt, it requires improvement, and there are a number of processes associated with it that require improvement. Many of the recommendations in the Diamond Head report would have helped to create some of those improvements. So not only do I think that this sets us back at least 5 years, I think it'll be a generation before we see anything comparable to the EDPA. We'll protect parks. We'll have legislation, regulation that goes the distance on the public spaces. But I don't think we're going to see anything like the EDPA, probably until my kids are old enough to sit here. And maybe when their kids would be old enough to sit here. And by then, as many people suggested, it may well be too late. So why wouldn't we take the opportunity to fix it? I don't know the harm in trying to make a better bylaw. I've heard, I think to a person, everyone say that they support environmental protection. They support a better bylaw. And to me, it seems counterintuitive and counterproductive to simply scrap it in the hope that by starting over again, we'll somehow come up with something better. The optimist in me says, I sure hope that's the case, and I'd love to see Saanich adopt an even better bylaw, one that learns from some of the mistakes we identified in the EDPA. I imagine I'm not going to be around, at least in this council chamber, to see that happen, and I think that's truly regrettable. So I will not be supporting the motion to rescind the EDPA.
Thank you, Councillor. Go to Councillor Sanders.
The public and such coming out and speaking to us this evening. I too do not support the rescinding of the EDPA. I think this is a step backwards when we have the opportunity to deal with all the public input we've had and be able to make it a better bylaw. Neither the Rollo report or the Diamond Head report recommended rescinding. Council was provided the recommendation of the Diamond Head report, and we were advised on how we could implement them. Again, there was no suggestion on rescindment. Much discussion has taken place about the EDPA over the last several years. It took 25 years of environmental protection into one document when it was created. This was done incrementally using tools provided to local governments by the provincial government. The EDPA was implemented using Saanich's public participation policy. They had open houses, including presentations, identifying all the aspects. Homeowners were notified, community associations, the greater community. Meetings were advertised, as well as when it came before council for consideration. There were displays throughout all the community recreation centres to educate people on what the EDPA was. So Saanich is well known for being a leader in the environmental stewardship. They have an incredible environmental stewardship program. You just need to go to our website and where it says, you want to get involved? Become one of our environmental stewards. Any weekend or even during the week, you can see volunteers in our parks. The Pulling Together program is working in 40 parks. Groups can be seen anywhere. The bylaw was put in place in 2012, and it went about protecting what it needed to protect without a peep. And suddenly in 2015, it became a huge issue. I can't even imagine why.
Audience, please. Audience, please. Go ahead, Councillor Sanders.
2012, it was put in place. Not a peep till 2015. We weren't hiding it. Rescinding the bylaw is a step backwards. Not only a step backward, but not an option that was recommended by either the Rollo report or the Diamond Head report. Should the bylaw be rescinded? I'm concerned about the impact that will be done to Saanich's environment. I'm also concerned for the homeowners that were pleased to be in the EDPA. This would leave their properties unprotected. More so, they were not afforded the opportunity to speak to rescinding, as they never knew that was going to be the option. I also question why properties that have been removed from the EDPA through the process available would lobby to rescind the bylaw and put so many properties in Saanich in environmental jeopardy. Not just the natural environment, but the biodiversity, the life that impacts our wildlife, the wildlife corridors and nesting areas. This is an opportunity now for us to review the Diamond Head recommendations, implement as suggested. This is not the time for us to scrap 25 plus years of environmental stewardship and us being leaders throughout the province. As one speaker said, the EDPA is one of Saanich's building blocks of environmental stewardship. This is time to improve the bylaw, not to throw it out. I don't support rescinding the EDPA bylaw. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Sorry. Councillor Bryce spoke on the amendment. Would you like to speak on the motion? I'll go back to you if you like.
I think I feel compelled to say something because after all of the hours and years of discussion, I think it's important that we explain why we take certain positions, and certainly the passion and the interest in our public is apparent, and as well, colleagues, your passion and your commitment to this as well, I respect. I think that everybody who spoke here this evening, there was something that I could take from their comments and think to myself, yes, I could say that. That could be me there saying that. And so we find that there's points on either side, whether to rescind and replace or whether to maintain and amend. The issue of whether or not we want to protect the environment and have an EDPA, that's not up for grabs. We've all made a commitment to that, and certainly most of the public who have spoken to us over the months and indeed years have indicated that that's where they wish to put their efforts as well. We've been through such a journey with this, and while I can certainly understand a reluctance to rescind, I feel that at certain times with certain issues, enough has happened that you really do owe it to everybody to start afresh. I think that there will always be those who feel that they were let down by Saanich Council when the original EDPA came in. I don't believe that myself. I do know what process we went through, but I understand that there are people who feel that way and were impacted that way. When we had the Saturday meeting on the 28th, folks from both sides of the issue stood up and on occasion mentioned that they were experiencing physical difficulties because of what this issue has done and meant to them. We can't have gone through that trauma and then just say, well, let's just carry on and try and fix this thing. I think we owe it to our community, we owe it to our council to say we've learned a lot. We're not starting at square one. We've learned a tremendous amount. It's been quite a learning experience for all of us, and I think if we take that knowledge that we have learned, carry on with the passion and sincere efforts by all of us to improve the environment and put protections in place for the long run, not for this term, not for 10 years from now, but the 100-year vision that we are working towards. This is worth working on. This is worth another try. We can't just say, well, this was good enough. From our community's point of view, there's still enough people who feel that it is outside of their ability to find this as a potential protection to continue working on, and I'm prepared to work with you, and I'm prepared to work with council, and I don't see this as a generational shift by any means. I see this as well within our grasp to be able to deal with it. This is tough stuff, but it is not impossible. Other communities have done it, and we can do it as well. I look forward to working on it. Mr. Mayor,
Through this whole process, we've heard a lot of issues, implementation, mapping. Saturday, I heard a gentleman talk about how he felt the wording of the bylaw was confusing or not very clear. For me, the bylaw, I was looking for a better bylaw. It's the reason I voted to spend taxpayers' money on the two reports, both the Diamond Head and the Rollo report. So it was always looking to see how we could do it better. This motion that is on the table tonight to rescind the EDPA bylaw as opposed to renewing it and updating it with recommendations from our independent consultants, Diamond Head, is contrary to a number of adopted policies from the greater community that were developed to create our Sustainable Saanich OCP, our climate action, and our adaptation plans. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other environmental policies. Our consultants did not recommend rescinding. Some think this will mean starting all over again, and others think not. No matter how anyone thinks this process will happen, it will take a long time. It will take extensive financial resources. Hopefully, Council will put that in this year's budget. Extensive staff and or consultant resources. Very extensive public engagement. Then public input at Committee of the Whole, and then public input at a public hearing. Who knows how many ecosystems, especially the Garry Oak, we could lose through development in the interim. And that ecosystem, if that ecosystem is in a building envelope or a service corridor, we lose it. The OCP states in part, continue to protect and restore habitats that support native species of plants, animals, and address threats to biodiversity. Protect and restore rare and endangered species, habitat, and ecosystems, particularly those associated with the Garry Oak ecosystem. Require restoration plans. Link environmentally sensitive areas and green spaces where appropriate to maintain the biodiversity. Saanich's natural setting is characterized by the Garry Oak ecosystem based on projected changes with climate change, increasing temperature, storm events, wind events. There will be impact on our natural systems, such as increased pollution, nutrient overload, and much more. The Garry Oak ecosystem is the richest land-based ecosystem in coastal BC. They're home to more than 100 species at risk. It is in Saanich, we have both red-listed and blue-listed species at risk provincially. There are many recommendations from the consultants, including the biodiversity conservation strategy, conservation funding, or looking at reduction in property taxes to promote protection, rolling back our environmental policies to 2012 before the EDPA will have less protection of our natural environment and less connections for biodiversity. Just in one instance, sensitive ecosystems, Garry Oak, in general, would no longer be protected from infill, excavation, blasting, clearing, building, or paving over. So for all these reasons and so many more that other people have raised over the public process we've done, I will not support rescinding the EDPA. I think we can do it better by looking at the reports that we've got from experts that were external from us.
Thank you. My name was sorry,
A few people have mentioned that the Diamond Head report did not recommend rescind. On page 5 of the Diamond Head report, throughout our review of the ideas and options for revising the EDPA bylaw, we have made efforts to address the main sources of concern identified during the engagement process. That being the case, we also acknowledge that some stakeholders have raised the broader question of whether or not the EDPA should be repealed. This is their words. Given that our scope was to revise the EDPA bylaw, consideration of this question was outside our scope. People have mentioned why was the repeal arrived at as one of the motions on the 28th. the repeal was in one of the options given to us by staff. So people have mentioned we've disrespected staff, but we've actually adopted one of the options from staff. So just want to put those two pieces to bed. Now, we've also heard that the majority of land, if we look at the protection of the ecosystem, 100% of the land in Saanich, the majority of the land is privately owned. The EDPA only impacts around 5% of the homes owned in of the homes in Saanich. 50% of the EDPA is in private land hands, 50% is in public hands. If we look at the total land mass that's protected by the EDPA, it is less than the land mass that's protected by our environmental and social review. Why do I say that? The marine backshore is 60 metres. There's 50 metres of to every ALR, every park. We have 168 parks. Any natural park within 50 metres can be looked at as environmental and social review. Any watercourse, stream, lake, river, any floodplain development permit area. So if we look at the value of that, there is a greater land mass that can be protected under the environmental and social review policy. And that protection is based on ground truthing. For example, if it is deemed to be environmentally sensitive, you can apply an environmental and social review application. This is in the hands of staff and council. So this, to me, when I look at all this information, I do not see that we're stripping away the protections that are there when we repeal the EDPA, should that be the will today. I see that there are robust protections, and we heard from Councillor Price with an amendment to Councillor Harper's motion to put back the tree protection bylaw and the fill bylaw and the streamside bylaw, the couple of items that are not covered by the environmental review, the building permits, the blasting permits, the excavation and vegetation removal. We understand those pieces as well. But when you look at the total land mass that is potentially protected by using the environmental review, it is far greater. Now, where would we look to in particular? We would look, perhaps, using the aerial view map that indicated where there might be environmentally sensitive areas, but we'd have to ground truth it before we made that application. And it's the mapping that many people have pointed out as one of the problems in adopting the current EDPA, because it's set off on the wrong foot. When we look at time, we're worrying about, a few more years to get it right. I was one of the councillors that went to all of the properties that came forward to be reviewed for exclusion from the EDPA. And council voted as a group to remove those, because my eyes, when I looked at that property, I didn't see, according to the list of ESA plants and things that could be there, that there was an environmentally sensitive area. So, as you know, councillors voted to lift several properties out of the EDPA. So the ground truthing is key to this. Now, where are we going? Some people have dropped in and said, well, we did all the work with the Diamond Head. We did all the work of the other reports. That's true. These aren't going to be wasted. These will provide core material as we go forward and rebuild an EDPA. In balance, as well as the environment of plants and animals, human beings are included. And I have seen great stress, great trauma on both sides of this argument. And I do not see the opportunity to repair it with a rebuild. I see a better opportunity for good governance with a rescind. We already have people saying unkind things about each other right now. Let's put all that away and start again, come together as a collective and take over a broken process and rebuild a new one. Saanich is a leader in environmental issues. We have a massive amount now of community knowledge on how we can go forward. Let's harness that and just build the most fabulous EDPA that gives us the resilience and the mitigation opportunities to the climate change that people are worried about. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Plant.
Mayor, I think most people around this table know that I like theater, but I can't help but feel tonight is just a repeat of performance that we saw last week, and so I'm not going to say everything that's been said and not fill my 5 minutes. I think at the end of the day, Council, and apologies to the audience, I don't consider this time to speak to you. I'm going to look at my colleagues. At the end of the day, the decision that we are going to make, because I believe it will pass, we have heard from staff that the provisions are less. You can spin it however you want, and you can take offense and call a point of order that I'm calling it spinning. But our staff have repeatedly told us that the protections are less. Now, I'm okay if that's the vote that you choose to make. I always respect the will of council. But I would suggest that the options that were put forward by Mr. Thorkelson in the report a couple days before also had other options. And the other options, in my opinion, would have been preferable. Nobody at this table, in my mind, is of the opinion that the EDPA is working or that it should have just been left alone. We were all willing to move forward. The 5 of you who are choosing the route of rescinding, I respect your decision. I completely disagree with it. But you are elected and you have the right to be here and make that decision. But I think it is one that is not a very strong decision when you hear from staff that it is less protection. So, for me, I did see another way forward. And I'm going to throw it out like a life raft in the last moment, recognizing there's a motion on the floor. And that other option would be to add all single-family homes to the temporary exemption, which is essentially the same as rescinding. And, excuse me, in the sense that the EDPA would not be applied to single-family homes anywhere in Saanich. Then the EDPA would still only apply to subdivisions and rezonings, which again, I would state, we have heard from staff that an ESR is less protection than the EDPA. I think that's the better way to go, and we would have then found less divisiveness in our community. I think our community could have lived with that everybody could have used their property, and that the rezonings and subdivisions would have been attended to. I think the way we're going sends the wrong message. It sends the message that we think spending $50,000 on Diamond Head was not the way we should have gone, and that we are acting in a short-term interest. I'm going to end with the final comment, and that is the comments that have been made tonight a couple times, and I think it's on us. I think council has to address what's been called the elephant in the room, and I do think council needs to have a discussion about how we are challenged with the perception of the public of how our staff has implemented this bylaw. And council has to have that discussion. It probably can't happen in open session because it deals with personnel matters, but I think council, we need to have that discussion because everybody's alluding to the elephant in the room, and I think it is regarding implementation, and I think I'll certainly move to put it on the next in-camera agenda because I think we need to have that discussion. So I said I wouldn't talk long. I guess I proved myself a typical politician. I took my full 5 minutes, but I do suggest, if you think of nothing else, think of what staff have said. Less protection than what we have currently. Period. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor, I'm going to speak a second time because I'm not content with the suggestion again that there is less protection at the level that is smaller than the community good of healing the trauma and the division in the community. The items that are not included would be blasting permits, blowing up rock, excavation and
financial investment. So I hope council is going to keep their open mind when we do budget, when these things appear on the budget for some financial resources. Thank you.
Any more speakers on the motion? If not, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Opposed? None opposed? That carries unanimously. Thank you. All right, and we'll look for that report to come back at future time. Councillor Plant?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I recognize that amendment didn't happen that I was alluding to, and I'm wondering if council will have the opportunity, perhaps either now or at a future time, to expedite which component we may wish first. And I'm wondering, maybe I can ask through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Thorkelson, is it possible that the report that we have essentially asked you to provide us as a council could include, in your mind, ways of expediting the EDPA provisions first, or do you think that needs to be explicitly asked for?
I'm confused actually by your question in that what council will be considering is really going back to some kind of fundamental discussion with the community about what we're trying to do in terms of environmental protection. That precedes any discussion of what a new EDPA might look like. This motion, from my perspective, talks to that kind of fundamentals, suggesting that there would be some
is starting at the beginning, that there be a prioritization.
What I would say is that we will bring forward options for council to consider. Council will give us direction on what you wish the priorities to be, whether that is through examination of the options that are brought forward or through this item coming to the strategic planning check-in. As council's aware, the check-in is primarily to update council on the process and the status of projects that have already been prioritized by council that are in our work plans, and bring forward other items that have been identified by council. Since our last check-in, I would suggest to council that this is the only new item, in quotation marks, that's been brought forward by council. So this would be the only item that would be coming forward. It is going to take staff quite a bit of time to come up with a report that outlines potential options for these things. These are grand and broad and deep requests. Any suggestion that this is going to be fast-tracked, I think I want to be blunt with you. We are looking at multiple years of work here.
Okay, then having heard that and having heard Mr. Thorkelson, his opinion, I would like to move that this item of the EDPA be referred to the next strategic planning session.
My apologies if I wasn't clear. It already will be on that agenda, given the direction.
Okay, then I rescind the motion if the seconder will do the same. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, the motion is withdrawn. Okay. That last comment. So I understand, I really understand where we are and how we got here, and I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of patch things a little bit. But I think we don't have to do a deep post-mortem on how we got to this point to really understand that whatever step is the next step forward, that it has to identify a problem, and then it has to be piloted in some way, right? We have to really figure out what it is. To try to do something on the large Saanich scale, biggest municipality in the island again, I think is really fraught with danger. We really need to take some baby steps on this and then figure out where we are, and then we can put a lot of resources behind it. But I'm personally reluctant with something coming back that, whether it's a lot of work or little work that entertains multi-years of work at so much cost, I still really need to understand what it is. What are the short-term things that we can do? What are the long-term things? What we can get people to adopt without actually having a bylaw in place? Those kinds of things. We need to really look at those options. That's what I'm hoping comes back. But we really need to define what the problem is and then figure out how to test it before repeating the mistake that we just making similar mistakes. I really feel that is the approach that we should be taking. So let's move on to the next item.